The A-Push world. I'll put this, as always, this Word document up so we can have our definitions, things we have to discuss along the way. But we'll move quickly. As always, try and get as much done as we can. You can keep this video and go back for a little bit in case you missed things that we said in our haste. So most of us left off here with these violations by the aggressors, predominantly Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan throughout the 30s, where the League's response was tepid, warm, or just nothing at all. So recall, we'll begin here. I think many of us were at the Rhineland in our discussion, where, again, that's part of German territory. That was the buffer Clemenceau called for in the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler does this, it just looked like it was part of his country, which it was. Not a great, egregious foul on the world scene. People let it go. The Allies were out of the Rhineland at that juncture, and there was no response. Hitler himself, however, said that if the French had marched into the Rhineland, they would have had to have retreated with their tails between their legs. And history now sort of agrees on this one point, that 36 was the last time a collaborative effort by the Allies militarily could have indeed stopped Hitler and his advances. Either way, the Rhineland is overlooked. People want to keep the peace more than push back, as we established in class, contextualizing these reactions. This here was the union of Germany with Austria in March of 1938, something that the international order again looked past, as it just seemed like the right thing to do. Most people in Austria wanted this union. They saw a successful Germany, a recovering Germany. Austrians are Germanic people ethnically. Recall Hitler was born in Austria. So when this is announced, Hitler calls it a parade, not an invasion, which it literally was a parade. The German military marched in and was received warmly by the Austrians, most of which again wanted this union, which was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So again, the world looks past, lets this go. We should point out at this juncture the Holocaust is raging. On day one of this Anschluss, the Jewish population is ordered to leave. 2 weeks later, the roundup formally begins. And we will cover that in a separate section towards the end, but just as a point of note, by this point, the world's well aware of what's going on there. And in some cases like this, the National Socialists were quite open about it. Of course, this Anschluss is referenced in a popular film, The Sound of Music. Some of you may have heard, and some of us discussed that to a small extent in class today. Okay, again, we mentioned this violation by Japan in 31. The United States did nothing. The League did nothing outside of sanctions on Japan, which will then cause that country to leave the League in 1933. Remember, that was February of 33. Japan's out first. Hitler follows, exiting the League in October of 1933. One more part to mention here about Japan. The invasion of China continued, I guess, in earnest, in 1937, going beyond the borders of Manchuria into nationalist China, which was democratic. That's the name Chiang Kai-shek on the Word document that you saw. We'll talk more about him later, but the best democratic option in China was Chiang Kai-shek, who the Japanese invade in 1937. The League did nothing, and the United States did nothing, even when one of their gunboats, you see here, United States gunboat, was sunk by the Japanese Air Force. And in that attack, 3 sailors died, 43 were wounded, 5 civilians, United States civilians were wounded, and in the end, the United States, the FDR administration, was forced to accept an apology by the Japanese government and leave it at this. So let's get a little time frame here. This was December 12th of 1937. Where the Panay was sunk. In October of 37, FDR had appealed to the nation for an increased U.S. role in the world to quarantine the aggressors. Famous phrase by FDR, quarantine the aggressors. This, of course, in 1937 fell on deaf ears, as isolationist sentiment is the popular belief of the country. In a popular opinion poll shortly after that quarantine speech, 70% of the American population wanted Americans out of Asia, all Americans out of Asia, and for the United States to take a step back in the world scene. So the president was kind of backed into a corner at that juncture and accepts an apology. The Sudetenland is next. This is September of 1938. Hitler announces his intention to take over this most industrialized portion of Czechoslovakia. You'll remember 3 million Germans lived in the Sudetenland, which again played right into the National Socialist hands. The Nazis infiltrated that government. They got a hold of the population there and made it sound on the world scene like those 3 million Germans wanted to be part of the Third Reich, the National Socialist government, which would then make Nazi Germany not look like an aggressor, which at this point may have raised eyes and led to a military response. So the response by the democracies to this intention to take over the Sudetenland and basically bankrupt Czechoslovakia was the Munich Conference held in Germany, September of 1938. Czechoslovakia is not there, not even invited. It's decided here by the British and the French that Hitler and the Nazis can have the Sudetenland as long as they promise no future invasions, which of course was a promise made at the Munich Conference. Hitler kept that promise of no future aggression for 6 months until the formal invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia, what you see there, Operation Green, in March of 1939, which was a little more aggressive than the parade of the Anschluss. This here is an outright violation of the sovereignty of an independent nation, Czechoslovakia. The democracies at this point don't do much. There will be a reach to Poland, or a statement to Poland saying that the British and the French will defend Polish sovereignty should the Nazis continue. That will be relevant in a moment. FDR at this juncture continues to argue for neutrality, but begins to increase military preparations, as that is, of course, not a question of if, but when. So these maps here just kind of sum up or show all of the aggression that we mentioned with the Italians in Ethiopia, Japanese expansion into China, and the growing size of the Reich, the Third Reich, by 1939. Okay, at this point, we have to turn our attention to the Soviets because it helps explain the next action by the dictators, the National Socialists in particular. So in 1939, the British and the French try to negotiate a mutual defense agreement with Moscow and the Soviets to halt Hitler's advance. And remember, that's part of the Popular Front. That's part of the belief to some degree in Britain and France that a strong Germany was actually necessary and good to keep the order of the post-war European world. The Soviets, however, will shock the entire globe on August 23, 1939, when they sign this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which you might see as the Nazi-Soviet Pact or the Non-Aggression Pact, when both agreed there will be no aggression between the two, at which the world breathed a sigh of relief, as these two were seen as the next logical step, as these two were seen as the leaders who would plunge the world into round two, formerly World War II. So this was a sign of relief for the democracies, for the Western world. Secretly, however, there's the mutual goal there of retaining territory lost at the Treaty of Versailles in response to World War I. So public part of Molotov-Ribbentrop, named after the two foreign ministers there of the Soviet Union and Germany, respectively. The public terms, non-aggression. The secret terms, divide Poland and regain that territory lost after World War I, which is a clear indication the Popular Front has failed. If you can't beat them, join them. The Soviets saw a window here to recover that valuable lost territory, giving more access to the sea and trade. It's also a clear indication that by this juncture, appeasement has failed. Operation Green is the formal death of appeasement. Molotov-Ribbentrop gave a little relief to the tension. However, it's clear round two is right around the corner, and that begins with Operation White, the German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, at which point the Germans unleash a new tactic of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, on Poland, and in the early pre-dawn hours, the bombing begins, phase one of blitzkrieg, followed by the dive bombers to kill anything else that survived the initial bombing, followed by the tanks, and then finally the ground troops walk through and get rid of any other remaining resistance. So this blitzkrieg completely caught the Polish off guard. Of course, the Nazis made up an incident on the Polish border to justify this act, which was complete fabrication by the National Socialists, and World War I is begun. Within 3 weeks, the Polish government will capitulate to the Nazis. Polish Air Force was wiped out on day one, to give you an idea of the strength of this blitzkrieg here. But with that, the war is on. Blitzkrieg proved very effective. Again, the roundup of the Jewish population begins in earnest as soon as the Nazis are into Poland. And the next, 2 days after that, September 3rd, 1939, the British and the French honor a pre-war agreement to defend Polish sovereignty put in place after Green, and declare war on the Germans. So September 3rd, 1939 will begin the phony war period, as it's listed on that sheet. The phony war from September 3rd, 39 to May 10th, 1940, these major powers are at war. The British and the French declare war and then do nothing. And they do nothing for a few reasons. One, it's winter time, and armies in winter during World War II still had to succumb to the weather and wait out spouts of bad weather, which we'll see play a decisive role in the last-ditch effort by the Nazis for success, to the death of many Allied troops. The weather, that is. Two, they were unprepared. Appeasement had placed the Germans well ahead militarily of the Allied democratic forces, so there was no military preparation, therefore no military means to push back against the Germans. And throughout the winter of 39-40, we see little to zero action. The Soviets in the spring will invade Finland, as you can see here. So this is the Nazis taking over Finland aggressively. In the spring of 1940, we will also see the invasion of the neutral states. So the invasion of the neutral states, really you include Finland in that with the Soviet Union. For the National Socialists, it is Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The invasion of the neutral states. Throughout the spring of 1940, we see the expansion of the Third Reich, and therefore access to ports, naval trade ports, and many resources. Quickly here with Sweden, which you see kind of stays out of the mix along with Switzerland. Both remained neutral to some extent, and to a more moderate, major extent, not puppets within the Nazi system. So Sweden specifically was selling iron to the Nazis. They told Germany they'll be neutral, told by the Germans, they would have to remain neutral, or could remain neutral, but have to be pro-German. The Swedish government refused and threatened to blow up the mines, the iron mines, at which point the the government threatened force and surrounded Sweden, forced them to capitulate, which Sweden eventually will, and remain as a puppet throughout the war. Switzerland bore no benefit to really anyone strategically, geographically. They'll remain neutral, but to a major extent a puppet of the Nazi regime also. So this is all spring of 1940, the invasion of the neutral states. So we see the Soviet Union and Finland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands for the National Socialists, which is then going to set up a different beginning to World War II than we saw in World War I, when the Germans were bogged down in the Netherlands and Belgium. And that's where the Schlieffen Plan failed, you recall, leading to that stalemate on the Western Front. There was no stalemate with Blitzkrieg. The spring saw a quick defeat of the Netherlands and Belgium, which put the Nazis right on the French doorstep, which will begin in May of 1940. So that's really considered the end of the phony war. May 10, 1940, Operation Yellow begins, German invasion of France. On that same day, May 10, 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Britain, and we're going to talk extensively about Churchill's leadership throughout the war and his interpretation of the post-war world order developed alongside FDR, as those two became great friends. France falls by the end of the month, by the end of June. By the 14th, the Germans are in Paris. Blitzkrieg blasted through the Maginot Line, the defensive line set up by the French, and they fell to the Germans quickly in 1940. Then this shocked both the United States and the British, who was left alone. The only thing standing in the way was the British. So Hitler, if he took over Britain, would have had access to, you can imagine, a tremendous amount of resources and territory across the globe, which could have severely extended Nazi control and influence across the world. So Britain standing up at this juncture was vital. And we really see a revolution in U.S. thinking as a result. So we'll get to that in a moment. A few pictures of the Blitzkrieg, the Nazis marching through the Arc de Triomphe, built in honor of Napoleon, the new technology of the war, which was much different than World War I. Those tanks were disastrous, and these were actually quick and maneuverable and much more effective. Okay, here we see Dingbat by the Eiffel Tower, and his time in France will inspire tremendous architectural development of Berlin that he sought to build to an extent that put Paris to shame, which was obviously architecturally advanced to most of the European cities. So on the right there we see Arno Baker, Hitler's favorite sculptor, and on the left that's Albert Speer, the architect, who will go back to Berlin and go on a massive building spree to attempt to establish Berlin as the premier city in Europe. The flag here on top of the tower is an interesting story. Before the Nazis got into Paris, the cables were cut for the elevator to get to the top, so the German soldiers were forced to walk up the tower to raise the Nazi flag. The first one they put up was too large. It blew away. A different one had to be replaced there. And there are stories of resistance by the French to constantly replace that flag with the tricolor, the French flag, throughout the war. But a Nazi flag will fly over that symbol of French prowess until the end of 1944. With the capitulation of the French, you see here the extent of the Third Reich. By 1940, this is what the world had to contend with, and a massive amount of resources, socio-political control over the new European order, which is National Socialist control. You saw on that sheet a term, Vichy France. So technically, we have two Frances in World War II. German-occupied France would be the northern portion of the country, the Atlantic coast. German-occupied France, which was capitulating to the Nazis and under direct Nazi military control. To the south was Vichy France, a puppet government loyal to the Nazis, run out of a town in southern France called Vichy. So if you see Vichy France at any time, that's what that's referencing. Simply put, the French had control of France. It was broken into those two different zones, as we said. German occupied to the north, Vichy France to the south. All right, so let's get into a little bit the shift in public thinking, the revolution in U.S. public sentiment and government thinking. FDR, when this war broke out, did not ask the United States to remain impartial as Woody had done. That would have been, of course, impossible. But while alarmed by blitzkrieg and the reports of the rapid German advance, the United States public still did not want to enter World War II formally. In the early stages, many still believed in that stalemate theory, again on the Word document, the stalemate theory that the two sides would, again, as World War I had panned out, get bogged down in a defensive battle on the Western Front and sit there for years and years until one side finally gave. Well, blitzkrieg put an end to that. The spring of 1940 and the defeat of the neutral states put an end to that. And of course, that theory, that stalemate theory, was completely debunked with the rapid success of Operation Yellow and the defeat of France by the National Socialists. So we've already mentioned we've got a shifting public dynamic. The president thinks Britain's survival is imperative to U.S. security, as we've already mentioned, as the first line of defense against the Nazis here in the Western Hemisphere. So after debate, those neutrality laws were basically lifted piece by piece. And here we see the Neutrality Act of 1939, formally, casually, I guess, more referred to as cash and carry, where the armaments restrictions of 1935 are repealed, that arms embargo of the Neutrality Act of 35, in replace of a policy where the British could pay in cash and use their own ships to carry goods from U.S. ports. And that's armaments and non-armaments also to support the war effort. So the president asks for that in September 21st, 1939, asked a special session of Congress. We talked about that, remember? He calls a special session again for this instant. And that Congress reacted, passing the Neutrality Act of 39, or cash and carry, on November 5th of that same year. The spring and summer of 1940 saw some other advancements or changes in U.S. thinking. And we'll begin here with the Havana Conference, which was a deal made in July of 1940 for the United States and Western Hemisphere countries to uphold the Monroe Doctrine. So if we shift for a second back to our U.S.-Latin American relations sector or conversation, this is a major turning point for the Monroe Doctrine, which has now shifted from being underscored with the U.S. desire for imperialism and economic benefits, as we've seen, to a policy of collective security by the region to defend against European aggression. So let's put that into context. 21 nations total agree with this Havana Conference decision that the Monroe Doctrine will be upheld by all. Why is that? Well, with the fall of the neutral states and France, many colonies in the Western Hemisphere were vulnerable. And those were colonies held by those neutral states, which are now could technically be claimed by the Nazis. So once unilateral in nature, the Monroe Doctrine is now multilateral after the fall of those neutral states. Okay, let's sit here for a second and go over two other shifts. One, in that spring, summer, early fall of 1940, the president asked for and received the first $1 billion defense spending bill in United States history. All told, the United States will approach $37 billion in spending to build up the military, planes, and ships prior to World War II, which you might recall more than the entire cost of World War I, which was $32 billion. So we see that first billion-dollar defensive budget in United States history at this juncture. Also, very significantly, the first peacetime draft in United States history. On September 16th of 1940, Congress signed the Burke-Wadsworth Bill. It's on the sheet, or the Selective Training and Service Act, September 16th, 1940, the first peacetime draft, which set a goal to train 1.2 million soldiers to prepare for World War II. In 1940, we're still a ways out, as you might know. Okay, lastly, let's end here with this Battle of Britain and the effects on U.S. policy. So, in the summer, August of 1940, the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, launches an air attack on the British to prepare for a September invasion. So here we see the famous RAF, the Royal Air Force, fighting the Luftwaffe in a bombing campaign, which was a significant bombing of Britain, civilian and military targets. So here the RAF is supported by United States airmen and planes, but mostly this is the British fighting on their own. It is this Battle of Britain that shifted public opinion to a large degree in the United States, as people were listening to Edward Moore there on the radio, broadcasting reports of the battle between Britain and the Luftwaffe on the United States radio. The public listened to this, to the struggles of the British civilian population, and this significantly shifted public opinion to support the British. Not get into the war yet, but public sentiment starting to shift to outright support of the British, and we'll see that come into government policy, where we see here in September of 1940, by executive order, the President made a unilateral deal to support the British, trading 50 aging destroyers for access to naval and air bases in the Caribbean that were held by the British. So we could connect that into the Havana Conference also, in an effort to protect the Western Hemisphere. The President made this decision to give, basically, 50 aging World War I destroyers to the British in return for access to naval and air bases in the Caribbean. Very controversial, unilateral executive order, even more so considering this is on the eve of a presidential election, November of 1940, which we will get into on Thursday, back live in action in class. Write down your questions. We'll go over anything before we begin at that point. And thank you for listening. Bear with me as I look to get out of here. Adios.